Mary's Plant by Scott Weedman. It resembled an agave plant in the beginning, the kind from which tequila is made. They're everywhere in our agreeable, temperate corner of the world, ubiquitous, to quote my wife, Christina. So what stopped me that morning could have stopped anyone, I suppose. The only difference is whether or not they'd have written about it, as I've chosen to do. And I do hope these pages make a difference somehow, in some when. There are other names for what follows here: yucca plant, century plant, American aloe. In this case, the first, I'm certain, names fell away quickly. This was something different. Before Mary's plant sprouted, before that bizarre sense of inescapability loomed over us, I recalled two former neighbors arguing over a struggling patch along a common fence line. Neighbor A wanted them left alone, as they took years to sprout, something they did just once before dying. What's more, indigenous birds perched on their branches. Neighbor B couldn't have cared less. He called them prehistoric weeds and demanded they be uprooted. He said their spiky leaves were dangerous. He said, "F the birds." The large blue-gray plant about which this account is written grew unaccompanied in the front yard of a modest home on a modest street in Southern California. It belonged to a sweet, elderly woman named Mary Trumbo. I must have passed Mary's home 1,000 times over the 12 years my wife and I lived across the street and 2 doors down. I never noticed the plant before, or its bruised, asparagus-looking stalk. I was walking Humbert, our chocolate lab, one Sunday morning when I came upon it, and darn it all if that initial impression didn't tell me everything I needed to know. The stalk was at least 15 feet taller than Mary's single-story house. Its shadow bisected the faded, salmon-colored stucco like a large crack. My mind sort of balked then. I had gone for a run the evening prior and passed Mary's home twice without seeing it. It was August, and the sun didn't fall behind the western line of the cookie-cut roofs until after 8 p.m. I remembered her lawn gnome with its pointy hat and lederhosen. He was a marker for me. 60 yards to your front door, so give it gas if there's any left. The figurine now rested on its side. I stepped gingerly onto the landscape rock covering Mary's front yard. They crunched under my feet. Humbert sat down on the sidewalk, indifferent, tongue out. The base of the plant looked like an immense, frozen splash of brackish water. Its fronds were long and wide and edged with hooked barbs. They tapered into spines that looked capable of piercing anything. Neighbor B was right on the money here. The center shoot was tall and thin and, I don't know, paltry-looking compared to the defensiveness around its base. That notion changed the following morning. I placed my thermos on the roof of my car and patted my pockets. The spring morning unfolded around me with sublime regularity, the effervescent hiss of sprinklers, a dog barking in the distance, the back-and-forth whir of a gardener's leaf blower down the street. I had forgotten about Mary's plant. "Dale?" someone said from the sidewalk. It was Barbara Dachau, our neighbor 3 houses down. Barbara was a power walker, and it wasn't uncommon for us to exchange pleasantries in the mornings. She wore an immaculate Nike tracksuit, lily-white tennis shoes, also Nike, and Bose headphones around her taut, sweat-sheened neck. Barbara was a widow and young. "Hey there, Barbara," I said, fishing through my carry case. I had never officially met her former, late husband, Mr. Frederick Dachau. We exchanged nods over the years on the occasions when he tinkered in his garage with the door up, and I passed by with Humbert. My distinct impression, up until Frederick died of a thunderclap heart attack, and Barbara became something akin to a millionaire, was that the two were grandfather and granddaughter. "Have you seen that tree across the street?" she asked. The word tree caught me. I glanced over and forgot about my keys. Mary's plant had grown. I set my briefcase down. Barbara would later tell an eager reporter that it plopped from my hand. and walked across the street. I couldn't reconcile what was in front of me with what I'd seen yesterday. The plant's shoot was as thick as a palm tree and twice as tall as an adjacent telephone pole. And just how high were they anyway? 35, 40 feet? I stood mute and blinking, the agreeable sounds of dogs and sprinklers overlaid by Barbara's strident shouting from across the street. Mary's plant had grown 4 or 5 times its previous size overnight. That was, of course, impossible. I'd heard that certain bamboo species grew something like 6 inches a day, and eucalyptus was the fastest growing tree, but this was unreal. 2 things occurred to me then, and I latched onto them as they offered some semblance of logic. I happened upon Mary's plant the Sunday before last, not yesterday. What's more, Humbert and I had simply turned right out of our driveway during our evening walks last week, the opposite direction of Mary's house. In my relative surprise, I simply spliced 2 Sundays ago with this morning and overlooked 8 days of growth. 8 days of growth. I could buy that. Could I buy that? And then Barbara was beside me, saying we needed to inform the owner, a woman named Margie Tudlow, she believed, that this thing could fall and damage her home, perhaps our homes, and that it needed to be cut down. The city. She was convinced the city could help. Mary's plant loomed over us, its shiny wine-colored stalk jutting upward to a bulbous tip, where it faded to a lusterless and somehow ominous black. Though darkly beautiful, the whole of it produced a feeling of unease in me I couldn't articulate. Ditto for Barbara as she made a repugnant huffing sound after giving the thing a final glance and resuming her walk. It got me thinking of the monolith in that Kubrick film, or the ever-present crack of my closet door when I was a kid. Coming home from work, I spied a city parks and recreation truck in front of Mary's place. A woman wearing a khaki blouse and shorts was standing outside with Mary. The woman was gawking upward and speaking into a handheld radio. Mary stood on the walkway to her stoop in a blue robe and pink slippers. Her hair was white gossamer. She regarded the plant monopolizing her yard as if seeing it for the first time, and a small part of me guessed that might be the case. She turned delicately to ask a question of Miss Khaki, but the city employee was busy prattling into her radio. Poor Miss Trumbeau looked bewildered. Barbara Dachau stood tall in her driveway in stilettos, painted-on jeans, and a gaudy fur wrap around her neck. She couldn't have looked more appeased if she tried. Noticing me noticing her, she turned and popped open the trunk of her Mercedes with a jab of her key fob and began lifting out large, glossy bags. Further down the corner, 2 boys, middle schoolers by the looks of them, sat on bicycles. One pulled out a phone and snapped a photo of Mary's plant. He showed it to his buddy, who nodded. Just then, a sheriff's patrol car rounded the corner and stopped behind Miss Khaki's truck. A deputy stepped out in a slate gray uniform and Stetson hat with gold tassels on the brim. The hat cast a shadow across his face, exposing a stubbly, buttressed chin. He rested a hand on the grip of his revolver and looked over at me, Barbara, slight pause, the 2 kids on bikes. Both had phones out now, videoing. And then up. Exhilarated, Barbara jabbed her key fob again and strolled towards her front door. The Mercedes chirped once and its trunk whirred shut by itself. The officer sauntered over to Mary and Miss Khaki and tipped his hat. A silver Toyota Prius approached slowly and settled behind the patrol car. Inside, a balding man of about 40 in a tweed coat with patches on the elbows winked up through his windshield like an astronaut taking in some alien landscape. He produced an encyclopedia-sized book and leafed through it with earnest. A faculty tag dangled from his rearview mirror. The deputy and Miss Khaki conferred as they waited for the newcomer. Mary had retired discreetly to the rocker on her stoop. I decided to check on her. "The department issues pea shooters," the officer was saying as I slipped past. I approached Mary. "Hi, Miss Trumbo," I said, sounding more sympathetic than intended. She regarded me with tender confusion. "Mr. Paulman," I said, "from across the street, 3720. She paused, then whatever disconnect she felt from the goings-on caught, and she smiled. "What a nice surprise. Dale, I believe? How are you and your lovely wife?" She asked this sweetly and matter-of-factly, as if it were just last week that we'd met for the first and only time, and not a decade earlier, when she swung out of her driveway and flattened our mailbox with her Cadillac. I believe it marked the beginning of the end for Mary and her land yacht. Not 6 months later, a charity car's tow truck hauled it away. Since then, it was Uber, Lyft, or the occasional yellow cab that took Mary to and fro, though I couldn't recall the last time I'd seen either in front of her house, let alone 3 vehicles like today. "Happy and healthy," I replied. I glanced over my shoulder. The astronaut botanist was emerging deliberately from his car, as if he expected Mary's plant to suddenly swoop down and eat him, something the deputy looked ready to do to Miss Khaki at any moment. "There's a lot of, activity here today, Miss Trumbo. Are you all right?" I couldn't tell if her delicate nodding was recognition of my concern or a discreet form of palsy. "Aren't you a bit of honey?" she said. "I'm well as to be expected, I suppose." She shifted in her rocker and winced. "Getting old. It's a dadgum conspiracy, I tell you." She gestured past me. "I'm not sure of what to make of this schmozzle in my front yard, but I'll be all right." "Do you have someone to call in case of emergency?" I asked. "Perhaps we should exchange numbers." Mary reached out, and I offered my hand. "I appreciate that, Dale. Sure, we could do that." She smiled wryly. "Your wife isn't going to find my number and raise heck, is she?" She chuckled, but I could hear the nervousness. "If you wouldn't mind glancing over every now and again, that would be fine too." It was determined that Mary's plant was of the genus Agave, of the family Asparagaceae, of the subfamily Agavoideae, of the order blah blah blah. What threw everyone was the size. Officer Guy Weller's contribution to the day, outside of taking a statement from the astronaut botanist and handing over his card, "Please be by your phone in case you're needed," he'd said with a solemn authority, was asserting that Mary's plant was tall enough to cause concerns over air traffic. The municipal airport was just 5 miles away, and the airspace overhead was on the nether reaches of its flight path. Mary had say over the plant's fate, of course, but if she couldn't address the issue herself, the city could seek a resolution to do so without her consent. And just how tall was it? That was the million-dollar question after I described my experiences over the weekend and again that morning. I'd admitted to myself that I'd not gotten my Sundays mixed up about the time Mary took my hand on her porch. Miss Vroom got busy answering the question by using an old logger trick. Producing a yardstick from her truck, she held it out so as to create a right angle with equidistant sides. She positioned herself on the sidewalk across from Mary's plant and began walking backwards, eyeing the top of the stick relative to the plant's black, distended tip. Officer Weller and I watched with uncertainty, then outright skepticism when Miss Vroom stopped a considerable distance away, leaned on the yardstick, and scratched her head. Then she began to walk back in long, exaggerated steps. Arriving where she started, she announced, "The distance back yields the height of the object in question, 96 yards. This beast is almost 300 feet tall." Late that night, I came awake to Humbert growling in the dark. He stood at the bathroom threshold, head down, back furrowed. I whispered his name. His ears twitched. Then he padded to the closet, cocked his head, and began to whine. Christina swam up from sleep, clutching my arm. What is it?" "I don't know," I whispered, masking my own apprehension. "I woke up. Humbert Humbert barked. The sound was like a whip crack. Christina screamed. The entire room began to shake. Humbert shambled backwards. I remember thinking fleetingly how odd dogs look when they do, and jumped on the bed. From far off, laid over the grumbling like a live wire, came a silvery, rending shriek. And then all went still and quiet. I woke up at dawn and went out to the garage. I grabbed a 7-iron from my golf bag and stepped outside. The morning was cold, exposing my breath as I crossed the street to Mary's yard. I positioned myself in the same spot as Miss Vroom the day prior, and, after checking my measurements, held out my 7-iron. Just then, the sun broke over the eastern horizon, and the plant's stalk came alive in a medieval shimmer. I began backing down Catalina Drive. An aging Buick with cancer-stricken fenders coasted down the center of the street. A man in a wool cap tossed newspapers out of his windows, while Manfred Mann sang about silicone sisters and manager misters. He offered not so much as a passing glance at the middle-aged man in a bathrobe walking backward holding out a golf club. When my 7-iron lined up with what I perceived to be the top of Mary's plant, I yard-stepped back to where I'd started. 241 yards. You do the math. I left a message at work that I wouldn't be in that day. I made coffee and dropped a slice of bread into the toaster. Humbert watched patiently from the living room. I went to the kitchen window. The sun was higher in the east, and across the street, the stalk's iridescence gave way to audacious streaks and swirls of purples, greens, blues, browns, yellows, and reds. Notions of 2001: A Space Odyssey were giving way to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Humbert whined. I turned. "What's going on across the street, Humbert? You got any ideas?" He yawned, long and wide, a sign of anxiety in dogs. "Yeah," I said, turning back. "Me too." What was in front of Mary's house? It was rare, of course, but had it ever been seen before? It was a subject for the record books as it bested the tallest tree on record, a 380-foot redwood named Hyperion in Northern California. Could it make Mary famous, rich, or both? Her fretful look yesterday told me that neither notoriety nor wealth were welcome. People her age just wanted peace and quiet, not a spectacle in their front yard. Barbara sauntered by in another tracksuit, arms pumping, chin high. Just before rounding the corner, she stumbled on a crack in the sidewalk and nearly fell. I smiled for the first time in days. She righted herself, looked around hesitantly, and then, noticing the plant's shadow across the sidewalk in front of her, she bunched up her arms, turned sideways, and hop-stepped over it. I looked back at Mary's plant, so gnarled at its base, so tall I couldn't see the top through my kitchen window. Over 700 feet, I thought, and for the first time, something like fear churned inside me. The city couldn't cut the stalk down. Doing so posed a threat to the housing tract. Officer Weller delivered the news as I carried an Amazon package, a 10-pound weighted blanket, into Mary's home for her. When she asked feebly what was going to happen, Officer Weller glanced at the plant, paused for effect, and said, "Well, ma'am, it looks as if they'll end up rerouting air traffic." An anxious look swept across Mary's face, and she brought a thin, age-spotted hand to her face. Officer Weller softened. "There's a trick to cutting down trees and such and having them fall where you want them to," he said. "The taller it is, the more perilous the job." Mary stared at him. The deputy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your plant, ma'am, is past that point. There's nothing we can do." He produced a contrived, sympathetic smile and left. Mary's house saw plenty of activity in the following days. Several tree-trimming trucks stopped to survey the plant. Despite the too little, too late discourse from Officer Weller, the city had obviously solicited bids for some sort of remedy. None stayed long. Another Parks and Recreation vehicle pulled up, a sedan with tinted windows, much more official than Miss Vroom's truck, but nobody emerged. A news van with KBAT, news that's new to you, across the side arrived. A female reporter in a no-nonsense outfit and power heels hopped out and glared up at Mary's plant. With cameraman in tow, she knocked on Mary's door. Mary didn't answer. Good girl. They recorded a stand-up in the front yard, the reporter walking cautiously around the plant, pointing out barbs and gesturing ominously to the sky. Trespassing didn't seem to bother them. Fearmongers, I thought. I fought the urge to step outside and shoo them off, maybe sick Humbert on them, but I'd probably end up on the 6 o'clock news. Another tree trimmer pulled up but quickly sped off as the interlopers scrambled for an interview, pointing their equipment like weapons. They milled around, knocked on a few doors, including Barbara's. She wasn't home. They never tried mine, thank you very much. Late that night, Humbert barked again, this time from a wallop of thunder. Christina and I went outside the following morning and stood on our stoop in matching robes. Officer Weller was across the street, staring up, the single dome light atop his vehicle twirling. Was his hand resting on the butt of his revolver or gripping it? Rolls of yellow caution tape sat atop his trunk. Before him, the wide shaft of Mary's plant disappeared fairy-tale-like into the morning clouds. "Is it Mary?" my wife asked. "I don't think so," I replied. "No ambulance, but something seems off." Indeed, the scene looked different, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was like looking at one of those side-by-side pictures in the back of People magazine where you had to figure out what was missing. Christina hugged herself and nestled into me. Then, the teenagers' videos went mainstream, and everything exploded. They posted their first video to their social media accounts at roughly 1 a.m. that morning. It received 1,000 hits by the time they tried for a double feature an hour or so later. They ran into production problems, you could say, and I'm sure KBAT thanks their lucky stars for it. KBAT went national with the stand-up in Mary's yard at 8 a.m., promising an exclusive interview with the teens whose harrowing night had just begun at the end of the newscast. After the ensuing break, the anchor reiterated the importance of staying tuned, because he'd never seen anything like it in all his years in the business, and to hear the boys recount the circumstances was startling. His co-anchor retorted that she'd never seen anything like it in her whole life, and she'd definitely be there. Not to be outdone, the anchor shot back quizzically that he hoped so, since she'd still be on the clock. They both chuckled for the camera. The video is set in night mode, casting everything in a green tint. Teenagers, the number of which is unclear, loiter in front of Mary's house. They whisper, giggle, and occasionally shush one another. In the background, Mary's plant looks like a gigantic claw. Someone off-camera asks how much time they have. 50 seconds, someone whispers back. A young man steps in close to the camera and holds up a can of spray paint, shakes it. We hear the little ball jangle around inside. He wears a baseball cap backwards and a t-shirt that reads, "Less stress, jobless." "Okay," he whispers. "You're all gonna freak out over this." He crosses to Mary's plant. The camera follows. Rocks crunch under shoes. Less stress squeezes between a pair of toothy, door-sized fronds. "Careful, bruh," someone murmurs. Less stress reaches up and sprays a thick line across the gray-green stalk. Both retreat hastily, but not before the teen's shirt snags on a barb and there is a jumbled moment of panic. Cut. Back on the sidewalk, the cameraman turns the lens on himself and declares the countdown is on and to get ready for some weird shit. Disembodied voices begin a surreptitious countdown. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. I feel it. This is it. 3, 2. There is a deep, petulant grumbling, and the camera pans to Mary's plant. Rocks dance around its base. The grumbling becomes a creaking howl, and the painted line suddenly shoots upward. They all shout. Mary's porch light comes on. They all scatter. Cut. 2 boys are being interviewed. They sit side by side in silhouette. Their voices have been altered and they sound like chipmunks when they speak. They describe how lucky they are, how they went out late to TP a friend's house when they witnessed the plant spontaneously grow. "We were walking past at the right time," the one on the right says. "Then it happened again, like 60 seconds later." The boy on the left speaks. "We realized it was growing in, intervals." The reporter: "You returned a short time later with a friend, correct?" "Yes," the chipmunks reply in unison. The reporter turns solemnly to the camera. He warns the audience that what they are about to see is real and might be disturbing to some viewers. Cut. Video from the back seat of a moving car. We see the passenger, he who feels life is easier unemployed, hold up his phone for the driver. "Seriously?" the driver asks, swinging the car back into its lane. "It's grown that much since yesterday?" The cameraman: "Yeah, my little bro was there and took the picture." The driver turns and smiles into the camera. "I want to cut that thing down." Cut. Driver ordering from a drive-through stand, indecipherable sound from speaker. He asks less stress what the fuck he wants to drink. Cut. Shot from the sidewalk, open trunk, night vision. Driver holds up a hatchet. "I'm gonna ax this thing a few questions." Cut. Mary's front yard. The cameraman whispers that the asparagus hasn't grown since they arrived, so Paul Bunyan over there is going to give it a piece of his mind. Camera pans. Our driver, hatchet in hand, stands impishly next to the foot of Mary's plant. He holds up a finger, indicating he'd like everyone to wait a moment, and belches. Cut. Less stress points out where he squeezed through the fronds before. Mr. Bunyan follows and positions himself for what he calls a few good whackaroos. The camera pans up. The silhouetted spire looks like a Titan's broadsword. Mr. Bunyan readies himself and raises the hatchet over his head. Grinning, he brings it down hard. Sparks spit from the impact. Generalized bewilderment from the group. Bunyan's face contorts into something sinister, and he swings again and again, his mad face brightening with each blow. Suddenly, a mossy light swells within the base of the plant, turning it momentarily opaque like an over-electrified bulb in a cloudy lamp. The glow whizzes upward, bullet-like, and erupts from the top. But instead of shooting into the night, it sits suspended above the coal-bloated tip like some warbling, fantastic eye, and casting all in dancing shadows below. It winks out. A cacophonous boom of thunder. The camera jostles, car alarms bleat, dogs bark. Now Mr. Bunyan. "Hey, whoa, get me out of here." The camera swings back to the base of Mary's plant. "This thing's not right," Bunyan yells. Less stress reaches out to help him. They are almost clear of the plant when it moves. The prongs animate and flex, looking like a hand readying itself. Creaking sounds fill the microphone. Both boys scream. In a whoosh, the base of Mary's plant pulls together. Less stress pinwheels from the force, falls, scrambles away. Mr. Bunyan shrieks as he is caught by the clenching branches and heaved off of his feet. Yelling, screaming, the camera jostles, refocuses. Mr. Bunyan struggles against the transfigured corm. The tips of his Chuck Taylors probe obliquely for purchase. One arm disappears at the elbow high along a raggedy seam. He reaches out with the other, hand opening and closing, opening and closing. His voice is a death whisper. "Help me, The base of Mary's plant, looking very much like an immense nightmare pumpkin, flexes, and a squelching pop fills the microphone as the teen is relieved of his arm and crumples to the ground. Through the night vision, the jetting blood looks like oil. Cut. I was offered a promotion at work. Accepting meant a hasty move to Colorado. I accepted without sleeping on it or discussing it with Christina. I said yes, and we shook hands, and all the while a voice in my head repeated, "You sense a sinking ship, Dale, and you want to scurry off. What does that make you?" I called a realtor friend who said he'd comp the area and get back with me. He called an hour later. "Brother, man," he said, sounding both excited and thoroughly flummoxed. "I have a buyer chomping at the bit. All cash offer, name your price. And do you know what the hell is happening on your street?" "Uh-oh," I said. "Get in front of a television ASAP," he said. "The buyer's agent is a friend of mine. Her clients want your place as is, sight unseen, no contingencies or walkthroughs. They hope that whatever Jack and the Beanstalk shit happening in your neighbor's yard happens on theirs." The world knew about Mary's plant by late afternoon. Onlookers and demonstrators clogged the entrance of Catalina Drive and lined the cross street for hundreds of yards. They pointed skyward, held signs and banners, "Let it grow, don't mess with Mother Nature, protect our citizens." A family stood atop a Winnebago. A woman in a smock waved a massive American flag while a man and two boys hovered over a camera attached to a tripod. A little girl of maybe 5 years old sat on the roof, her legs dangling over the vehicle's large, flat windshield. She held a paper plate over her head with the words, "The end is near," etched in purple crayon. I had to show my driver's license to gain access to my street. I passed Barbara in her driveway wearing a starlet hat and large mirrored sunglasses. She was smiling and waving. Mary's plant was approximately 1,700 feet tall. An Air National Guard helicopter circled overhead, snapping high-resolution photos, taking measurements, and reporting to several 24-hour live-stream sites. Bystanders who weren't holding signs, flags, or, believe it or not, tending to portable grills, were either filming with smartphones or staring wide-eyed into them. So when the top third of Mary's plant began to unfurl into elongated branches, tipped with school bus-sized pods like so many gnarled fingers, the world witnessed it firsthand, stupefied. Christina and I argued that evening, a real humdinger. What can a man expect when he sets such large things in motion without consulting his wife? The only reprieve was that her sister and husband lived outside of Denver, and we could stay with them until we found a place. The bottom of Mary's plant opened the following day. It did so slowly, deliberately, as if wary of the ever-expanding crowd. Nobody approached, of course, as Deputy Weller's caution tape crisscrossed Mary's yard. And then something toppled to the rocks and the fan of dried blood there. A hatchet blade. It was followed by another something small and tinny, a high school class ring. Both glistened wetly in the morning sunshine. We left for Colorado on the 4th day. I phoned Mary and asked her to come with us. I admitted that I was afraid for her and felt she would be safer with us. She thanked me in the same delicate tone with which she addressed Officer Weller. She was too old for a road trip, but appreciated my thoughtfulness. She wanted us to take leave and let whatever was happening happen. I asked, pleaded really, if there was anything I could say to change her mind. She thanked me again and hung up. More branches unfurled at dusk. Christina and I watched wide-eyed from a Dairy Queen in McKinley, New Mexico. These branches were lower on the stalk, and their splayed ends cast vast, oblong shadows across the subdivision below. A short-order cook stood behind us, rubbing his hands repeatedly on his soiled apron. Goddamn Dems, he spat. It took us 19 hours to reach Denver. Along the way, we listened to theories as to what grew in front of Mary's home. Scientists, botanists, biologists, dendrologists, plant psychologists, they covered everything. Tensile strength, hypernutritional requirements, modern and fossilized comparisons of carnivorous plants, even the meaning of the mysterious light in the stalk. It's the day of the Triffids, one caller swore, recalling an old sci-fi novel where secretly engineered plants came to life and terrorized the locals. Another recounted a time when he cut down an agave plant, referred to repeatedly as that tall mother grabber, in his own front yard, and how bits and pieces got all over him, and he broke out in hives and his balls swelled up something mean, and he needed a cortisone shot in the ass. We laughed then, despite everything. My sister-in-law's home is nestled between tall pine and spruce trees on a vast upslope of the Arapahoe National Forest. It's a beautiful place. I was at work in Idaho Springs when Mary's plant erupted. I don't know if that's the best description. Some say it came alive, but that's what occurred to me as a group of us stood frozen in front of a TV monitor in the break room on my first day. I imagine we resembled any number of break rooms across the nation years previous when terrorists used airliners as weapons of mass destruction. We were certainly witnessing the latter now. A woman standing next to me with hands jammed in her cheeks whispered, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." A man from accounting held a coffee cup with "upstream from the herd" stamped across it halfway to his lips. His hand shook. Coffee lapped over the edge. I vaguely recalled someone asking if I had just come from there. Mary's plant was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Enormous columns of black cloud billowed from its hands. No, not cloud. This was something else. Something impassable and glutinous and volcanic. It unraveled and spread across the sky like pelt, shutting out the sun. The lower branches opened up as well. They smothered the housing tract underneath, reminding me of when I spilled a gallon fence stain on my granddad's miniature train set when I was a boy. Then, erratic shards of ruby-colored lightning began flicking between the murky layers like so many lunatic thoughts, and the memory vanished. And I thought of Mary, Barbara, all my neighbors. The Army National Guard helicopter hovered a safe distance away, but not so far that it couldn't relay images. Its high-resolution camera found a man stumbling out of the black mist. He flailed and batted at himself. He shambled to a parked car and tried opening one of its doors. I thought, oh dear God, the stuff is toxic. In an instant, almost too quick to process, a shard of red lightning arced out of the darkness and vaporized him, sending his disembodied clothes twirling into the air. Everyone screamed. 2 asparaguses sprouted in a rural section of Bourgogne, France. They were 80 feet tall by the time a train conductor spotted them and called it in. The French, no doubt emboldened by the dreadful images from Catalina Drive, and that both specimens had grown to 400 feet by the time the sun rose the following day, promptly evacuated the area and leveled it with a tactical nuclear device. I can't blame them. Mary's plant draped hundreds of square miles in less than 100 hours before stopping its horrific belch and collapsing into a stinking squall 5 stories high. I can't imagine how many people it killed. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. The lightning never stopped. Never. Some say the blast triggered the next wave. Others say it was coming anyway. Plants began germinating around the globe. The videos are surreal. In one, a man in an orange vest and bulky headphones strung around his neck stands in a veritable forest of leafy shoots. He shouts in a foreign language and gestures off camera. We see they are standing on an airport tarmac. and all manner of aircraft have been overturned and pushed aside by the jutting sprouts. A Korean airliner is perched precariously atop a clump several feet in the air. Inflatable slides loll from the emergency exits like fat yellow tongues. In another, a commercial fishing vessel circles a gargantuan stalk that's emerged from the ocean. Water surges against its pea-green flank like breakers against a cliff. Barely visible seabirds circle the top. The cameraman steps into the lolling control room and points to a depth finder, 4,000 feet. There is a stunning panoramic photo of the Himalayas taken from the International Space Station. It looks like the Amazon basin. We boarded up as many windows as we could with plywood from the garage, then used mattresses and couch cushions. When the darkness finally came, it blotted out the sky and screamed through the Arapaho like some biblical horde. The temperatures dropped 30 degrees. We have a gas generator with a solar failsafe, ironically, perishables in a freezer, and lots of dry goods. We can survive maybe 6 months if the windows don't break or something doesn't come through the floorboards. I lifted a corner of cushion over the kitchen window and held up a flashlight. I wish I hadn't. The blackness, the mist, it's not volcanic or meteorological. It writhes and squirms like ash come alive. I'm writing from an upstairs guest bedroom. There's a portable safe. When I'm finished, I'll slide the manuscript inside, scribble the code on top in permanent marker, and lock it up. My brother-in-law knocks, holds a bottle of whiskey and 2 tumblers. The edginess that's gripped him, all of us, for the past 48 hours is gone. His face is sallow, eyes red-rimmed and sunken. He pours. We drink without toasting. "We need to discuss something," he says colorlessly. "How you and I should finish this if the time comes." I take another drink. Rachel has a bottle of prescription Valium. I have firearms. As long as our wives are asleep, we can end this on our terms. I know how that sounds, Dale, but I won't let my family be consumed or vaporized. I hope you understand. He pours again, shakily. "Why is this happening?" he asks rhetorically. A hell of a question, that. One I have no room to answer. But I do have an opinion. Call it a hunch or a premonition, but I think it occurred to me the moment I laid eyes on Mary's plant that morning walking Humbert. He's lying at my feet as I write. Do I believe this is some sort of cosmic retribution? We fooled with Mother Nature for too long, so out we go, just like that old commercial? No. I do feel, however, that we've forgotten what's under our feet. This dynamic sphere upon which we live our lives so blithely, something that has thrived in the cold vastness of space for billions of years. We've gotten so drunk on our frivolity that we've overlooked what our planet is, an interstellar survivor. I think what's happening now, as vengeful as it seems, is despite us, not in spite of us. There is no more cause and effect now than there was 65 million years ago when a sudden sulfurous darkness blanketed the dinosaurs. The cosmic egg timer has chimed, and the salting of the earth has begun. There's the door, folks. See ya. Wouldn't want to be ya. Elvis has left the building. Yeah, my brother-in-law murmurs. He swallows, and the click in his throat is loud and chilling. Maybe it's like that. Temperature down 40 degrees. The house is like a tomb. Pressure from outside. Voices don't carry well. Ears ring. Had to switch off the Jenny and cap the ventilation pipe after the plants blew their tops. There go the lights. I have my flashlight. My hands shake. Is it the cold? I don't know anymore. Something large just gave way downstairs, the bay window or the sliders to the deck. Bundled on the bed, my wife, Christina, sister to Rachel, daughter to Roy and Lydia, mother to no one save for Humbert, sleeps like the dead. An empty paper cup sits on the nightstand between us. I reach down and pet Humbert, such a good boy. Slowly, I roll up a towel from the bathroom and stuff it under the door jamb, and for a shocking moment, I don't know if I'm trying to keep something in or out. God, give me strength and forgiveness. Final thought. I hope that thousands or even millions of years from now, when whomever or whatever unearths this safe, they open it and discuss its contents, a few family photos, Humbert's collar, our IDs, and this document, through whatever form of communication they possess. If not, they'll have our bones. The darkness will see to that.